Hamelin Prison, dawn of December 13, 1945. The air was thick, cold, and silent. This was not the cold of the German winter. This was the cold of order, of procedural finality. Inside the gray walls, the machinery of justice operated by the British Army was preparing for its final task. It was precise, dispassionate, and unshakable. At 9:34 a.m., a steel door opened. Two military guards stepped in, and between them was the accused, Irma Grese, 22 years old. She walked steadily. There was no hesitation, no collapse. The witnesses present in the room, from journalists to officials, had steeled themselves for tears, pleas, or the hysteria of a young person facing their own annihilation, but they received nothing. Irma Grese walked as if she were strolling on a camp parade ground. Her blonde hair, which had earned her the mocking nickname the Blonde Angel, was neatly combed. Her prisoner's uniform was clean. She held her head high. Albert Pierrepoint, the executioner, a professional in his field, was waiting. He was a man of procedure. He had seen all manner of reactions: abject fear, silent acceptance, furious rage. But Irma Grese's reaction, or rather, the absence of one, commanded his attention. She was led onto the wooden platform, a simple structure designed for a single purpose. As she stood over the trapdoor, the guards held her arms, but she seemed oblivious to them. Instead, in a moment of almost unreal vanity, Irma Grese gently raised a hand to adjust a stray lock of hair, a small automatic gesture, a final grooming for the crowd, as if she were still performing. Pierrepoint stepped forward to perform his duty. He took the white hood and prepared to place it over her head. Grese looked at him, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the eyes of a supervisor irritated by a delay. She did not weep. She did not pray. She offered no apology, nor did she proclaim her innocence. She simply looked straight at the man who would end her life. And then, from the mouth of the 22-year-old girl who had overseen unimaginable brutality, a single word emerged. A command. Schnell. Quickly. The word hung in the quiet air of the room. It was not a plea. It was a criticism, an impatience. It was the voice of a person accustomed to being obeyed, one who regarded the delay in her own execution as a mere procedural inconvenience. In the final moment of her life, the Hyena of Auschwitz was still giving an order. Pierrepoint, the man of procedure, accommodated her request. The trapdoor opened. Justice was served. But the psychological autopsy had just begun. Irma Grese's death was quick and efficient, but her life was the true mystery. We are not here to re-examine the horrors of the crimes, the setting of starving dogs on prisoners, the beatings with cellophane-braided whips until victims collapsed, the arbitrary selections on the Auschwitz ramp, where a wave of her hand determined who lived and who walked immediately into the gas chamber. Those facts are clearly documented, attested to by survivors with permanent horror. Our question as psychoanalysts is not what she did. Our question is why. This was not the reaction of a soldier following orders. This was not the behavior of a person brainwashed by ideology. This was something more elemental. What happened in the mind of a young girl, barely 22, to transform her into a symbol of pure sadism? What turns a human being into a walking instrument of torture? To understand that final Schnell, we must strip away the skin of the monster. We must go back, not to the concentration camps, but to the dreary fields of Mecklenburg, to a broken home, and to an empty soul that was desperate for something, anything, to fill it. We must autopsy the birth of a sadist. To understand the monster, we must first understand the child. But when we look into Irma Grese's past, we do not find clear precursors of cruelty. We do not find an animal torturing child or a congenital bully. Instead, we find something almost more unsettling: mediocrity. Born in 1923 in Rechen, a remote rural area of Mecklenburg, Irma was one of 5 children. Her father, Alfred Grese, was a farm laborer. Their life was simple, harsh, and unremarkable. Neighbors later described young Irma as a shy, withdrawn child, even the family's stupid cow. She was not smart. She was not talented. She did not stand out. In the brutal social hierarchy of the schoolyard, Irma Grese was a marginal figure, an easy target for bullying, a quiet shadow. She merely existed. And then, when Irma was 13, that shadow shattered. Tragedy struck the Grese family not in the form of an accident, but as an act of violent self-destruction. Her mother, Berta Grese, took her own life. This detail is crucial. She did not simply die. She chose a gruesome method, drinking hydrochloric acid. It was a slow, agonizing death, a destruction from the inside. For a shy 13-year-old girl, witnessing or even just knowing of her mother's violent disintegration planted an indelible trauma. It introduced extreme violence right into the core of her family life. The home, already unstable, collapsed entirely. 2 years later, at 15, Irma dropped out of school. She had failed. The education system had discarded her. In a society increasingly obsessed with Aryan perfection, strength, and intellect, Irma Grese was a clear failure. She desperately sought a role, a place. And here is one of the most cruel ironies in her file. Irma Grese tried to become a nurse. Pause there and analyze that. She wanted to be a caregiver, a healer. She applied to a sanatorium, perhaps seeking a structure, a purpose, a uniform that could give her an identity. But she was rejected. Once again, the normal world had no place for her. She then drifted. She worked on a dairy farm. She worked as an assistant in a shop. Anonymous, dead-end jobs that affirmed her position at the bottom of the social ladder. She was a nobody, a wandering, empty soul. Her father, a Nazi Party member since 1937, was disappointed. He wanted her to settle down, but he couldn't control her. By 1942, Irma Grese was 18. She was uneducated, unskilled, without status, and traumatized by a violent family tragedy. She was an empty vessel. And then the Nazi system reached out a hand. It did not require her to be intelligent. It did not require her to be talented or compassionate. It only required obedience and a willingness to embrace its ideology. The BDM, the League of German Girls, welcomed her. For the first time in her life, Irma Grese belonged somewhere. She had a uniform. She had a purpose, however warped. But the BDM was only a stepping stone. For a young woman desperate for recognition, there was a quicker, darker path to advancement. Her father vehemently objected. When he learned she wanted to join the SS, he became furious. He was a party member, but he understood the implications of the camps. He beat her, forbade her, and when she defied him, he disowned her. His opposition did not stop Irma. It fueled her. Her joining the SS was not an act of family loyalty. It was a final act of rebellion against it. It was a total rejection of her failed past. She had tried to be a healer and failed. Now, she would try a different role. In 1942, Irma Grese volunteered as an SS Aufseherin female guard and was sent to her training ground, the Ravensbrück concentration camp, a hell designed specifically for women. This was no longer drifting. This was a choice. The shy, mediocre girl from Mecklenburg had found her path, and that path led straight into the heart of darkness. The question is, what happens when you hand an empty soul, a lifelong failure, the key to absolute power? Ravensbrück, and later Auschwitz, would soon provide the answer. Ravensbrück was not a typical prison. It was a laboratory, a crucible. It was where the Nazi system took ordinary women, nurses, hairdressers, factory workers, and failures like Irma Grese, and distilled them, stripping away compassion and leaving only ruthless efficiency. When 19-year-old Irma Grese walked through the gates of Ravensbrück, she didn't just find a job, she found a new family. An SS family. This was a hierarchy built on fear. Guards feared their superiors, and prisoners feared everyone. Irma quickly learned the first lesson. To stop being a victim, one must become a predator. And she, who had been a nobody her whole life, learned this lesson with frightening zeal. She observed the higher-ranking guards. She learned that brutality was not only accepted, it was encouraged. It was a measure of loyalty and efficiency. The hesitant were weeded out, the ruthless were promoted, and Irma Grese wanted to be promoted. The first reports of her at Ravensbrück show a rapid change. The shy girl was gone. In her place was a severe guard, eager to use her truncheon. But Ravensbrück was just the beginning. It was school. Auschwitz was her stage. In March 1943, after only a year of training, Irma Grese was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this is where the psychoanalysis becomes complex. Because at Auschwitz, Irma Grese was handed something she had never possessed in her 20 years of existence: absolute power. She was quickly promoted, becoming the SS Oberaufseherin, senior supervisor of the C-Lager, the women's section. At 20 years old, Irma Grese became the second most powerful woman in the entire Birkenau death camp complex. Let's analyze this. A young woman who had been rejected by a nursing school, who had failed academically, who had no social standing, now held the life and death power over an estimated 30,000 Jewish women and children. For a deeply insecure and empty soul, this power was not a responsibility. It was a drug, and Irma Grese became addicted to it instantly. This is where her psychological nucleus, the transformation into a sadist, exploded. Grese's cruelty was not like the bureaucratic, emotionless cruelty of many other Nazi officials who merely signed death papers. Her cruelty was personal, theatrical, and deeply sadistic. She didn't just enforce the rules, she created her own games. First, she changed her appearance. Irma Grese began crafting her persona. She was always immaculately presented. Her golden hair was carefully styled. Her SS uniform was perfectly tailored. She wore heavy leather boots, the sound of them clacking on the campground a sonic prelude to pain. And survivors consistently mention one detail: she wore expensive French perfume. Imagine the morbid contrast. Amidst the mud, the stench of disease, the burning crematoria, and the desperation was the image of this beautiful, perfumed young woman. She was not just a guard, she was a mockery. She was the devil with the beautiful face, a living reminder that even beauty could be weaponized into a tool of torture. And then she had her tools. She did not just carry a pistol. That was standard. Irma Grese carried a whip, but not a typical leather whip. It was a whip braided from cellophane and steel wire, a bespoke weapon. The cellophane made the cuts deeper, and the steel wire tore the flesh. She used it arbitrarily. Witnesses at the Belsen Trial recounted that Grese would stroll through the camp, and if a prisoner looked at her the wrong way or wasn't quick enough, she would lash out. She did not beat for discipline, she beat for destruction. And there was a pattern to her attacks. Many survivors, especially those who had been beautiful, recalled that Grese deliberately targeted their faces. This was not the act of a soldier. This was the act of sick jealousy. The mediocre girl who had been overlooked was now destroying the beauty she could not possess. She couldn't be prettier than them, but she could make them uglier than her. Her second tool was even more iconic: her dog. SS guards often had dogs, but Grese's dog, typically a German Shepherd, was specially trained. It was always kept hungry, always agitated. Grese would keep it by her side, and when she chose a victim, she would command the dog to attack, not to apprehend, to maul. She stood there, immaculate in her uniform, watching the animal tear into another woman. For her, this was the ultimate control. Even the animals obeyed her destructive will. But the climax of her power, her greatest stage, was the Rampe, the platform where the trains carrying Jews from all over Europe arrived. This was where the selection took place. SS doctors like Josef Mengele would stand there and, with a wave of the hand, decide who would go to the labor camp and who would go straight to the gas chambers. And beside them, frequently, was Irma Grese. She was not a doctor. She had no medical duty. Technically, she didn't need to be there. But she chose to be there. She participated in the game of God. Witnesses described her standing there with her pistol and whip, screaming, beating the confused, terrified people exiting the rail cars. She was reported to have participated in the selections, pointing to women and children, condemning them to the immediate march to death. She did this with enjoyment. No hesitation, no revulsion. Some survivors said she seemed to be savoring the moment. It was the ultimate display of power. The 20-year-old girl who had been rejected by the world was now deciding who was allowed to exist in it. What was going on in that mind? This was no longer compliance. This was not, I am only following orders. That excuse would come later at the trial. But her actions betrayed that excuse. Irma Grese's cruelty was a creation. It was the product of an empty soul that had finally found something to fill it. That emptiness, that insecurity, that failure of youth was filled with pure sadism. She was taking revenge, not on a specific person, but on the world itself for having once considered her invisible. In Auschwitz, no one could ignore Irma Grese. They didn't dare. Her very existence meant pain. She had transformed herself from a nobody into a malevolent deity. Her cruelty was her way of screaming to the universe, "Look at me. I exist, and I can make you hurt." But like all self-made deities, her time was limited. As the Allies advanced, the system that created her began to crumble. She was transferred from Auschwitz to Ravensbrück and finally to Bergen-Belsen. It was there, in April 1945, when the British Army liberated the camp, that they found her. They found the blonde angel wandering amidst thousands of decomposing bodies, still arrogant, still wearing that uniform. The machine had stopped, but the monster hadn't realized it yet. Her stage had been destroyed, and now all that remained was the trial. September 1945. The courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany was packed. This was the Belsen Trial, one of the Allies' first attempts to hold the world accountable for the unspeakable. The air was thick with outrage, grief, and a desperate need for justice. And at the center of it all, in the dock, was Irma Grese. She was the youngest defendant in the room, only 21, turning 22. But she instantly became the focus. The international press, eager for a symbol of Nazi brutality, descended on her. They dubbed her the Beast of Belsen, the Hyena of Auschwitz, and most ironically, the Blonde Angel. To those in the courtroom, she was a visual contradiction. How could a young, apparently normal, even attractive woman be the author of such inhuman acts? This is where our psychological autopsy moves from the battlefield to the courtroom. Facing justice, the true nature of Irma Grese was most clearly revealed. The contrast was stunning. On one side, the survivors. Men and women, emaciated, scarred, their voices trembling with trauma, recounted seemingly impossible stories. The steel wire lashings, the dogs set to maul, the arbitrary selections for the gas chamber, the kicks with the heavy boots to exhausted bodies. They cried, they shook, they pointed at Grese, their voices breaking with the horror of identifying their tormentor. And on the other side in the dock was Irma Grese. She sat there, completely composed. Witnesses described her as bored, almost indifferent throughout much of the trial. As the most horrific testimonies were translated for her, she did not flinch. There were no tears, there was no remorse, not a flicker of shame. Here's the telling detail. Irma Grese's greatest preoccupation during the trial appeared to be her own appearance. The guards reported that every morning before court, she spent extensive time combing and meticulously styling her hair. She walked into the courtroom as if on a catwalk. She was acutely aware of the cameras, of the eyes fixed on her. The Auschwitz stage may have been destroyed, but she had found a new one. The dock. Occasionally, her indifference broke, but it did not break into remorse. It broke into contempt. When one witness recounted a particularly savage act, journalists noted that Gray looked at the witness and snickered, a slight smile, a silent taunt. To her, this was not a trial of crimes, it was an inconvenience. These victims were not humans recounting their pain. They were troublesome accusers, and their testimony was ridiculous. When it was her turn to speak, her defense was predictable. Ich habe nur Befehle ausgeführt, I was only following orders. That excuse collapses instantly under scrutiny. What order required her to braid a steel wire whip? What order dictated that she set her starving dog on defenseless women? What order compelled her to systematically beat prisoners, aiming for their faces? None. This was not compliance. This was creation. This was agency. Her cruelty was self-invented, nourished by insecurity and gratified by absolute power. She was not a cog in the machine. She was an engineer of the machine on her own micro level. The "I was only following orders" defense implies that the person acted against their will, or at least without initiative. But every action of Irma Grese screamed initiative. She wanted to do it. She enjoyed doing it. And now, facing the consequences, she was morally unintelligent. Her psyche was completely dissociated. To Grese, those prisoners, the untermenschen, subhumans, were not people. They were material. And you cannot be convicted for destroying material. This brings us to a core analytical question. What is more terrifying? A monster who knows they are doing evil but chooses to do it anyway? Or a monster who has so completely lost the ability to distinguish right from wrong that they regard their crimes as simply daily work? Irma Grese belonged to the latter. Her impassivity in the courtroom was not an act to show toughness. It was the truth. She genuinely did not believe she had done anything wrong. On November 17, 1945, that arrogance broke, but only for a moment. The sentence was pronounced death by hanging. For the first time, witnesses saw Irma Grese falter. The indifference vanished. She turned pale. But then, just as quickly, the mask of arrogance returned. She was escorted out of the room, not as a repentant sinner, but as an insulted supervisor. The courtroom had done its job. The facts were recorded. The testimonies were heard. But the impassivity of the blonde angel left a chilling question for the analysts. How could a human being go so far that, when cornered by the world and faced with the evidence of their own brutality, they still feel nothing? The answer lay in the final moment, the final act of the drama. The machinery of justice was set, and it waited, cold and precise as the very evil it was about to remove. We return to the moment. Hamelin Prison, 9:34 a.m., the trapdoor. Irma Grese's psychoanalysis does not end with her death. It ends with her word, Schnell, quickly. That final word is the key to the entire file. This is not the voice of courage. Courage requires an understanding of fear and overcoming it. This is not acceptance. Acceptance requires remorse or an understanding of destiny. No. Schnell is the voice of supreme arrogance. It is the exasperation of a tyrant who cannot believe she has lost control. In the world she created for herself at Auschwitz, at Belsen, her will was absolute. Everything moved at her pace. Life and death were decided by her mood. And now, facing a procedure, a justice procedure that she could not control, her primal reaction was not fear. It was impatience. It was the final offense. The girl who had been the blonde angel, the master of life and death, now had to wait for a man to finish his work. Her last word was not a confession or a prayer. It was a final, futile command. The file on the Hyena of Auschwitz closes here, and as we lay down the psychological scalpel, what do we see? We do not see a sophisticated product of Nazi ideology. Irma Grese was not a philosopher of hate. She was not an ideologue. We see a void. Irma Grese was a profound emptiness. A childhood insecurity, an academic failure, a family tragedy, all created a hole in her soul, and she was desperately looking for a way to fill it. The Nazi system did not create the monster Irma Grese. It simply enabled her to be one. It found that hole, and instead of filling it with purpose or compassion, it gave her something much easier: power. Auschwitz was not where she was brainwashed. Auschwitz was where she was liberated. For the first time in her life, the shy, mediocre, failed girl could be somebody. And the only way she knew how to be somebody was by destroying others. The whip, the dog, the tailored uniform, all were props in her personal drama of domination. Her cruelty was a massive overcompensation for her own emptiness. Justice, in the end, arrived. It was not emotional. It was not revenge. It was cold, surgical, and inevitable, like the very evil it confronted. Albert Pierrepoint, the executioner, in his notes, described her as the bravest woman he had ever hanged. But perhaps he was mistaken. He did not see courage. He saw the final arrogance of a soul that had died long before the rope tightened. He saw an empty shell. The final psychological autopsy offers a warning. It warns us that the monster does not always look hideous. It is not always a screaming fanatic. Sometimes it is something much quieter. Sometimes it hides behind a beautiful face, golden hair, and the terrifying, deadly emptiness of a soul that traded humanity for power.